Okay, very good. Thank you. All right. So can somebody tell me the 20 key people in the Old Testament? And you can group them up, starting with the 6 in Genesis. Who can do that? All right, how about we do this? Somebody just tell me the 6 in Genesis. Okay, Miss Carol. Very good. So, can somebody tell me Israel's 11 leaders or groups of leaders? And let's make it even easier. Tell me the 4 who led during the tribal period. I'm hearing Moses, Joshua, the 12 judges, and Samuel. What about the 4 kings who led during the kingdom period? Somebody? Saul, David, Solomon, 39 kings. And then who are the last 3 of the 11 leaders? Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Okay. The other 3, yes, thank you. The other 3, Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, and the prophets. Okay. We don't have to start over, do we? Come on. Y'all get with me here. Somebody tell me the 3 divisions of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is divided into 3 major divisions. Somebody tell me what those are. Somebody got it over here? Historical books, the poetical books, and prophetical books. How many historical books are there, everybody? How many poetical books are there? How many prophetical books? What do we call the first 5 historical books? The Pentateuch. What do we call the first 5 prophetical books? Major prophets. And what are the others? Minor prophets. Okay. Here's some more review. How many of you remember this chart and the 5-step cycle that the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, would go through during their 400-year history during the Judges period? The first step would be what? Anybody remember? They would stray from God, and then God would what? Next step. Allow an enemy nation to overrun them. And then the next step would be that they would cry out to God for help, for deliverance, and God would be faithful. He would send a deliverer in the form of a judge. And then what was the 5th step? They would follow God for a little while, and then they would fall right back into this same pattern. And so they repeated this cycle, this pattern, was it 7 times during that 400-year period. We also studied about the nation of Israel. After Solomon was king, it divided into 2 nations, a northern nation and a southern nation. What was the name of the northern nation? What was the name of the northern nation? Israel. What was the name of the southern nation? Judah. What was the capital of the northern nation? Samaria. What was the capital of the southern nation? Jerusalem. I'm not putting it up there because I can't remember what order I've got it in up there. So Samaria and Jerusalem, how many tribes were up north? 10. How many tribes were down south? 2. Okay. See, I had that backwards. I knew I was wrong. Anybody remember how many kings? There were 39 kings in all. Do anybody remember how many kings the northern kingdom had and how many kings the southern kingdom had? That's a hard one. So we had 19 and 20. And how many good kings did they have in the north? None. And how many in the south? 8 good kings. All right. Remember, these are the 11 books in the Old Testament that contain the 95% of the narrative of the Old Testament. It's not in order because we have Leviticus missing and Deuteronomy is missing and Ruth is missing. But those 11 books, remember, if you read them in order, you get the narrative of this Old Testament story, at least 95% of it. But looking at them in that order, do y'all remember what's in the book? Well, how do we remember the contents of Genesis? What's it? In the beginning. What's the next? The death in a coffin in Egypt. So everything in the book of Genesis contains from the creation until Joseph's death in Egypt. So we go to the book of Exodus. What's the book of Exodus about? Mass exodus, right? Or exit, departure. What's the book of Numbers about? A census. How many censuses were taken? 2. One at the beginning and one at the end. The book of Joshua. Who's that book about? Very good. And who is the book of Judges about? The Judges. Very good. 1 Samuel. Who does that book cover? Samuel and Saul. And 2 Samuel. Who's that one about? David. Then we have 1 Kings. Solomon. 2 Kings. 39 kings of the divided kingdom. Ezra is about Ezra, but who first? Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel and Ezra, and then Nehemiah is about who? Nehemiah. Very good. Leviticus. So now we're going back and catching the other books we skipped. What's the book of Leviticus about? Levite handbook, priestly handbook, right? Deuteronomy. What is this book about? 2. I see the 2. That's good, 2. It means the second giving of the law, right? Means second in a series. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is just another a couple of books that tell us about the history of the kings, which we already read about in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And this gives us a little more of that narrative. The book of Ruth, what's something we can remember out of that book? Wherever you go, I'll go. What can we remember out of the book of Esther? Right? First, if I die, I die. Who is it? There's somebody on the radio right now that's preaching through the book of Esther. I think it's, I get about 3 minutes of preaching on the way home and on the way back. I do enjoy it. Right now, he's the pastor at Shadow Mountain Church. He's written David Jeremiah. He's preaching on the book of Esther right now. And the 2 minutes I get going home and coming back have been really good. So if you want to hear a good series on the book of Esther, David Jeremiah, he's a good preacher. So the book of Job, we've talked about these and a way to remember each of those books. But let's talk about the prophets for just a moment. The major prophets and the minor prophets. Now remember, we've come up with an easy way to remember who they prophesied to and when they prophesied. So let me just say this. All the prophets, major and minor, prophesied before the Babylonian captivity except the last 3 major prophets and the last 3 minor prophets. So everybody else prophesied before the Babylonian captivity. The last 3 major prophets, did they prophesy during or after? During, right? Just read Daniel or Ezekiel, and immediately you realize that they're in the captivity. So the last 3 minor prophets, did they prophesy during or after the Babylonian captivity? After. Very good. And then we have this chart, which helps us remember who they wrote to. So again, we could say, with the exception of 5, all the prophets, major and minor, wrote to the southern kingdom of Judah. Everybody else, these 5 wrote to someone else. These 5, if you take the first letter of each of these 5 prophets, we have the acrostic for Jonah. So the first one is who? Jonah. And then we have, sorry, this doesn't line up. I made it in PowerPoint and I had to switch it to whatever Mac's version is. Anyway, so Obadiah is the next one, Nahum, Amos, and Hosea. So we know where Jonah prophesied. What nation? Nineveh, right? So he and Nahum prophesied to Nineveh. Obadiah prophesied to Edom, remember that? And then Hosea and Amos prophesied to the northern kingdom. Okay, so that tells us who they prophesied to. So that brings us to our New Testament section that we've been studying the last few weeks. So we've learned about 4 sections or time periods of the Gospels. So we're talking about the life of Jesus, the Gospels, 4 time periods. Who can tell me the 4 time periods? All right, let's name them together. Ready? Jesus' birth in first 30 years, Jesus' public ministry, the last week, the next 40 days. Okay? Let's say it again. Jesus' birth in first 30 years, Jesus' public ministry, the last week, and the next 40 days. So we've also learned the 15 major moves of the Gospels, but we didn't learn them all at one time. We divided them up. Their first 5 moves were made when? Before his public ministry. There were 5 moves made during his public ministry, and then 5 moves made during the last week and the next 40 days. So, looking at the 5 moves that were made before his public ministry, you have Mary and Joseph's trip to Bethlehem, the flight to Egypt, the trip to the temple at age 12, his trip to be baptized, and then the trip to the wilderness for 40 days. So those are the 5 trips during his, or before his public ministry. The 5 trips during his public ministry, you better know these. First, second, third, fourth, fifth circuit, right? And so hopefully maybe you remember a few things about these circuits. And the main thing is that he's just making a circuit from the southern area of Israel, Jerusalem, Judea, up to Galilee and back down during the first, second, third, fourth circuit. The fifth circuit is over to Perea, back and forth. And during that first circuit, these are some of the things that happened. So at first circuit, he leaves the wilderness, goes up to Capernaum, and comes right back down about 2 months later for Passover. The second circuit, he leaves again, goes back to Capernaum, comes back down a year later for the next Passover. It's also during this time when he meets the woman at the well. If you've are doing our Sunday school lessons, we had that lesson last week. Then the third circuit, he goes back up. He doesn't come back for the next Passover. I believe it's 18 months when he comes back for the Feast of Tabernacles, right? So he comes back for that. Here are some of the things that he does during that period. The fourth circuit, he goes back up and back down, and I think it's a short one, if I remember correctly. And then the fifth, those are some of the things he did. And then the fifth circuit is when he goes back and forth to Perea. He runs over to Perea with his disciples, gets word about whose death or whose sickness, Lazarus. But he doesn't go immediately. But he ends up going after Lazarus dies. He raises him from the dead, then returns to Perea, ministers there, does some of these things that you see on the screen, and then he ends up returning to Bethany to begin the last week in the next 40 days. All right, so now we have our last 5 trips. These 5 trips are the last week in the next 40 days. Trip number 1 is a back and forth trip, right? Back and forth to Bethany, or from Bethany. Trip number 2 is the triumphant entry. Trip number 3 is the trip to the cross. Trip number 4 is Jesus' 11 post-resurrection appearances. Trip number 5 is the ascension. All right, the 4 time periods of the book of Acts. This takes us back to, I guess, last week. So, all right, hopefully you remember this, right? This was this last week, right? Okay, so time period number 1 in the book of Acts, the church at Jerusalem. Anybody remember what chapters? 1 through 7. What's the next time period? The church scattered everywhere. Anybody remember the chapters? 8 through 12. Next we have Paul's missionary trips, and those are chapters 13 through 20. And then finally we have Paul's arrest and trip to Rome, and that's chapters 21 through 28. And of course we did the same with this map where you can kind of see it a little more visually. Now, we also began last week looking at the 10 major trips of the book of Acts. There are 5 trips in the beginning of the book of Acts, or first half of the book of Acts. There are 5 trips in the second half of the book of Acts. We've only looked at the first 5. That was last week. And so those 5 trips, those 5 major trips, let's just say them together. Ready? 120, go to the upper room. Philip's trip to Samaria. Saul's trip to Damascus. Peter's trip to the house of Cornelius, the gathering at Antioch. So we went through those in detail last week. Those are the first 5 trips in the first half of the book of Acts. So tonight, we're going to look, let's see, I got that up there a second time. We're going to look at the 5 trips in the last half of the book of Acts. So if you have your books, you can turn to, I believe it's page 111, and we can begin looking at these trips. And I want you to think about this for a moment. If you'll go home, and I know you may feel like you're behind on this, but you've got the book for the rest of your life. So you can go home and say, okay, let me go back and let me start over here with this, because the New Testament's a little bit tougher than the Old Testament part. And you can kind of go back and you can start over chapter 1 of the New Testament section and just work on that until you got it down, till you're comfortable with it. And then go to the next section and the next section. So you've got from now on to work on it. Don't stop just because we finish this in the next week or two. But here's what I want you to think about. We've learned about the 15 trips of the gospel, right? Major trips of the gospel. 5 trips before his public ministry, 5 trips during his public ministry, 5 trips the last week in the next 40 days. Then we've learned about the 5 trips to the first half of the book of Acts. Tonight we're going to learn about the 5 trips in the last half of the book of Acts. So in reality, if you can get all that down, you know about the 25 trips total, right, in the New Testament, or at least the Gospels and the book of Acts. That's a lot of info. If you can internalize it, that's a lot of info, because if you can remember the sequence of those trips, the 15 trips of the Gospels, the 10 trips of the book of Acts, and if you can remember a few of the facts that go with those, think about the knowledge base that you have of the Gospels, the life of Christ, and the early church, the birth and first 30 years of the church. That's a lot of base knowledge that you have. So I just encourage you to continue to work on this. So now we're looking at the 5 trips in the last half of the book of Acts. So let's say these together. I could barely hear some of you just a moment ago, so I need to hear you a little better. Ready? Paul's first missionary trip, the council at Jerusalem, Paul's second missionary trip, Paul's third missionary trip, Paul's arrest and trip to Rome. Now, this list shouldn't be too hard because we have 3 missionary trips. Paul's first trip, second trip, third trip. Now, between the first and second, we just remember he made a trip to Jerusalem. And then we need to remember at the very end, Paul, his arrest and trip to Rome. So this list shouldn't be as difficult as the first one. The first one's a little more difficult, at least to me it is. So this one shouldn't be too bad. So let's look at, actually there's a map we need to look at. So I think it's on page 112 of your book. You know, we had to learn a map, a basic map for the Old Testament in the moves. We had to look at a map of the New Testament land, Israel, to begin to trace the moves of the Gospels. And so now we need to look at another map of the Mediterranean area to begin to trace these moves that Paul is going to make during his missionary journeys. And so you have that map on page 111 in your book. I've got it colorized on the screen. So for me, it just gives me a little more detail to look at. Now, this is the area of the Mediterranean, and there's a little bit of a definition in your book. You may not know this, but the word Mediterranean is simply a large body of water that's surrounded by or nearly surrounded by land. So it's just the opposite of an island. In reality, there are actually a lot of, quote, Mediterraneans, but there are none like this one. Okay, there are none that even compare to the size of this one. And I think that in our book it's 2,500 miles from the coast of Israel until you get to the Straits of Gibraltar. And there are only 2 inlets or outlets, I guess you could say. One is the Strait of Miletus. It's about 2 miles wide. It goes into, is that the Caspian Sea? Where are my geographers? Black Sea. And then, of course, we have the Strait of Gibraltar here, maybe 4 miles wide. I had the opportunity to go through the Strait of Gibraltar one time. It's really neat because as you go through the straits, we were headed out of the Mediterranean. You could see the coast the continent of Africa on one side, very, very flat. And on the right-hand side, you could see the tip of Spain, which is very flat except for this one rock mountain that just sticks up out of nowhere called the Rock of Gibraltar. It's really neat. If you have time, go home, and everybody has Google on your computer, Google Earth. Find your way over here to this area, and then zoom down to the coast, to that rock. And it's amazing because it's as flat as this floor, except for this straight up rock. It's a mountain, it's not a rock. Don't look for a rock, it's a mountain. It's just amazing, though, that it's just sticking up out of nothing right there. But it's a beautiful place. So those are the two inlets or outlets, I guess you could say, the Straits of Gibraltar, the Straits of Dardanelles. Okay, so on the next page of your map, I think I've already got it here. These are the basic places that we need to know. I think there are 9 of them here. There are 2 cities that we need to know. We already know about one. It's Antioch. So on the northeast coast of the Mediterranean, right here where my little pointer is. The other city that we need to know about is Rome. Everybody should know where Rome is, over here on the boot of Italy, I guess you could say, the leg of Italy. So there's Rome. So those are the 2 cities we need to know about. And then there are 4 Roman provinces that you need to know about. And that's the province of Galatia, Asia, and in the ancient world, the Roman world, that was called Asia, Asia Minor. And then we have the province of Macedonia and the province of Greece. And then finally, there are 3 islands that you need to be familiar with: Cyprus, Crete, and Melita. Cyprus, Crete, and Melita. And so I don't know that you got to memorize this map like we have the others, but if you can get that into your mind as you read through the book of Acts, you'll be able to trace that in your mind as you read these places that Paul and Barnabas are going to go to. So with that, let's go to Paul's first missionary trip. Paul's first missionary trip. I believe this is on page 115 of your book. I'm just going to leave our map, because if I leave our map up here, then you can kind of look at the map as I talk about some of the places. So Paul's first missionary trip. So Paul and Barnabas, you remember, they're in the church or at the church at Antioch. They're having that wonderful year, that gathering at the church at Antioch. So they're commissioned by the church to go on this first missionary trip. And so they leave and they sail to Cyprus, right? That first island on our map just off the coast of Antioch. And they travel across the island of Cyprus, just completely across the entire thing. And then they sail north to the Roman province of Galatia. And then while in Galatia, there are several cities they go to. In your book, it's listed: Perga, Antioch. Now, this Antioch's different. There's 2 Antiochs. This is Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Now, while they're in Derbe, Paul and Barnabas decide to retrace their steps. And so they go back to these cities and they appoint elders in the churches that they've established. And then after they go back to the previous 4 cities, and then after they've ministered there, they sail back to Antioch. So that's the first missionary trip that you read about in the book of Acts. So we leave Antioch. Paul and Barnabas travel across the island of Cyprus and then sail north to Galatia, travel through those cities, go back through the cities, appointing elders, and then sail back to Antioch. Mission trip, foreign mission trip number 1. Now, number 2. In your book, you'll see next the council at Jerusalem. Now, this is interesting because between Paul's first and second missionary trip, he goes to Jerusalem to kind of settle a theological issue that's come about. There are some Jewish Christians who have begun to debate Paul as to whether or not, before a Gentile is converted to Christianity, they have to observe the law of Moses, that the men have to be circumcised before they become Christians. And of course, Paul and Barnabas completely disagree with this, right? You know Paul's teaching, you're saved by grace, right? And not by works. And so between this first and second missionary trip, Paul goes to the church at Jerusalem. That's the main church. That's where the elders, the apostles were. James was there. So they go there. Paul goes there to talk to them to settle this issue. This is the only time in the Bible you'll ever read of a conference like this or a meeting that takes place like this. And so Paul goes there to get the answer from the elders of the church. And of course, they settle the issue. And thankfully, we don't have to observe the law of Moses. We don't have to observe the dietary laws and all the other ceremonial laws. We don't have to be circumcised before we become Christians. Thank goodness all we have to do is believe, right? By faith, we're saved through grace, right? And so they settled that issue once and for all between that first and second missionary journey. And that's in Acts chapter 15, by the way. If you want to read that. All the scripture references are in the back of your book, but that specifically is in Acts chapter 15. Now, moving to Paul's second missionary trip. This is on page 117 of your book, and I'll bring the map up again so you can kind of look at that as I talk about it. But Paul's second missionary trip, Paul and Barnabas are getting ready to leave, and they get in a little dispute. Can you believe that? Two Christians get into a little dispute. So what the dispute is over John Mark. Mark, who the gospel's named after. John Mark is Barnabas, his nephew, okay? And so apparently John Mark had gone with Paul and Barnabas on the previous trip, but for some reason he abandoned them. Okay, not sure why, but he abandoned them. And so Paul and Barnabas are getting ready to go on this second missionary trip, and Barnabas is wanting John Mark to go. Paul does not want John Mark to go because of the fact that he abandoned them. This caused a major dispute between the two. So they end up parting ways. Now, we don't know, and I hate to assume too much, but we don't know how they handled it. We don't know if they handled it well or if they handled it badly. But we know this. I think that God ended up blessing it because we ended up with not just one great missionary team, we ended up with two great missionary teams. So God ended up using it. God ended up blessing it. The only thing is we don't have a record of Barnabas and Paul's missionary journeys. I wish we did, but God didn't see fit that we needed that in our Bibles. We only have a record of Paul's missionary journeys. But Barnabas and Mark, and by the way, later on in Paul's writings, years later in Paul's writing, he writes good things about Mark. He writes good things about Barnabas. So this wasn't something that just split them forever. They were able to reconcile this, if they even needed to be reconciled, if it was even that serious of a disagreement. But anyway, they go their separate ways. Now, here's what happens. Paul takes a fellow named Silas with him. And first of all, they visit some cities in Galatia, the 5 cities that Paul and Barnabas visited the first time. They go back and they check on those 5 churches that they established. From there, they go to the Roman province of Asia. And there's an interesting story while they're there. Paul has a vision from God. In the vision, there's a man that comes to him from Macedonia, right? See the next province. And he's asking for help, wanting Paul to come to Macedonia. So Paul takes that as a message from God to leave Galatia and go to Macedonia. So in Macedonia, they minister to, and these cities aren't on there, but they ministers in Philippi, Thessalonica, that's the letters of Philippians, the letters of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, ministers to Berea, and then they move on to the province of Greece. There Paul goes to Athens, and then he goes to Corinth. After he's at Corinth, he heads back home to Antioch, but on the way he stops at Ephesus, and then he sails to Caesarea. From Caesarea, Paul goes to Jerusalem to attend a feast, and then after Jerusalem, he heads back to Antioch. Man, that was a lot of traveling in that second missionary journey. But Paul and Silas, they retrace the steps of Paul and Barnabas, going to those original cities in Galatia. Then they go over to Macedonia, and hits several cities there, then to Greece. Then Paul goes to Jerusalem for a festival and then ends up back in Antioch. So that's Paul's second missionary trip. You'll see Paul's third missionary trip in your book on the next page. So Paul, on his third missionary trip, he went through the country of Galatia, or the province of Galatia. He went to Ephesus. And notice this, and by the way, I don't know of anybody that can remember all these details, but if you could just remember a couple of things about these missionary trips. Missionary trip number 3, he spends 3 years in Ephesus. That's a good fact to know. Missionary trip number 3, he spends 3 years, and that's a long time in Ephesus, right? But he spends 3 years at the church at Ephesus, and from there he goes to Macedonia and Greece for 3 months. That's another fact. Might be easy to remember. Third missionary trip, 3 years in Ephesus, 3 months in Greece and Macedonia. On his return trip, so he's getting ready to come home, he stops in Troas, Miletus, and from Miletus, he sends for the elders of Ephesus to meet him. Now, when the elders of Ephesus come to meet him, he doesn't go there, he's meeting them somewhere else. The elders find out he's going back to Jerusalem, and they warn him, don't go. Don't go, Paul, your life's in danger. But Paul's bound and determined to go to Jerusalem. And so that concludes missionary trip number 3 after he meets with the elders the elders from the city of Ephesus. So that brings us to the final trip number 5, Paul's arrest and trip to Rome. So from the time that Paul meets with these elders from Ephesus to the end of the book of Acts, there's only one story left, and that's the story of Paul's arrest and his trip to Rome. Acts chapter 21 begins this story where Paul is arriving on the mainland of where Israel is, and again he's warned of trouble to come. He arrives in Jerusalem. He's warned a third time about his, trouble to come, that his life was in danger. And so what's happened is, remember, Paul already had to deal with some of these Jewish believers believing that you had to follow the law of Moses to become believers. Well, they're in Jerusalem for these festivals. They recognize Paul. They hate Paul. Even though they're claiming to be Christians, they hate Paul because Paul's teaching them, you can just forget about God. You can forget about the laws. You can forget about their traditions. You can forget about these things. And to the Jewish people, that's blasphemy. And so these, quote, Jewish Christians even get the Jews to turn on Paul. And so eventually Paul is arrested. They trump up some charges. In fact, they say that Paul brought a Gentile into the temple area. He didn't do it, but that's what they say he did. So he's arrested. They're about to kill him. There's a Roman soldier who saves him, places him basically under arrest to protect him for his life. And so he's taken to Caesarea. I don't have my map up now, but there we go. Caesarea is right on the coast of Israel. He's held in jail there in Caesarea for 2 years. There he appears before several people, gives his testimony several times. Eventually, he's taken by ship from Israel, Caesarea. He's taken all the way to Rome, but on the way, there's a storm that comes up. An angel appears to Paul, says, hey, listen, your ship's about to be destroyed, but no one will lose their life. And that's exactly what happens. The ship is completely destroyed, and everybody is saved, though, as they land on what island? Anybody remember? Huh? What island? Crete. I think it's Crete. I may be wrong, but I think it's Crete. But I believe that's where they land, is Crete. I'll have to double check that, but I believe it's Crete. But eventually they get on another ship from that island, and they go to Rome, where Paul's under house arrest for a couple of years. And he writes what we call some of the prison epistles, some of the prison letters, like the letter of Philippians. That's one of the letters that he wrote while he was in jail there in Rome. So here are our 5 trips, right? So we got 3 missionary trips, but between the first and second, we got a trip to Jerusalem, the council at Jerusalem. And then the 5th trip, the final trip, is Paul's arrest and trip to Rome. So I don't expect you to remember this tonight, but work on it, okay? Do your homework. So there's one more thing I want us to look at this evening before we go, and it's not in the order of your book. I'm going to go out of order because I think it makes a little more sense to go out of order. So let me get you to turn. Let's see. Oh, by the way, if you'll look at page 124, you will see all 10 of these major trips in the book of Acts. So that'll give you a page where you can actually look at, visually see all 10 trips there in one place. So that may help you as you try to memorize those 10 trips. So if you'll notice the next chapter in your book, it's the 8 men who wrote the New Testament. We'll do that next week. But if you'll look at page 128, page 128, you have what's called the 4 segments of the New Testament. The 4 segments of the New Testament. So I'm going to give you basically what's on this page, but I'm going to give you more, okay? And when we get this, then we'll be able to learn about the 8 men who wrote the New Testament. We'll be able to learn how the books are ordered, and we'll be able to learn the books of the New Testament. If you don't know them, this makes it a whole lot easier to learn the books of the New Testament. And so we'll catch up with that next week. But let me give you the 4 segments. Now remember, we divided the Old Testament. The Old Testament has 3 segments, right? 3 major divisions of the Old Testament. We have historical books, right? We have poetical books, and we have prophetical books, okay? So that's how the Old Testament is organized. They just took all the historical narrative books and grouped them together, put Moses' first 5 books together. They took the poetical books together. They took all the prophetical books and grouped them together. Well, the New Testament is similar. They grouped together books that had something in common. And so that's how we get the 4 divisions or segments of the New Testament, okay? So the first division of the New Testament is going to be the Gospels, okay? The Gospels. The second division is going to be the book of Acts. The third division, the epistles. And the fourth division is the book of Revelation. So let's say these together. Ready? Everybody with me. The Gospels, the book of Acts, the epistles, the book of Revelation. So that's the 4 divisions or segments, whatever you want to call it, of the New Testament. The Gospels, the book of Acts, the epistles, and the book of Revelations. Now, Revelation. So the Gospels. Now everybody should know this, right? Let's name the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All right. So we have that. So that's the first segment or first division of the New Testament. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And to sum up Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it tells us about the life and ministry of Jesus. That's the Gospels. What's the second division, segment? Acts. Can anybody tell me what book is in this segment? Acts. Very good. This is easy stuff now, right? Much easier than trying to memorize 25 trips, right? So Acts. So Acts, here's the summary of Acts. Ready? The birth and first 30 years of the church. The birth and first 30 years of the church. So the first segment, we have the Gospels. The second segment, we have the book of Acts or Acts. What's the third segment or division in the New Testament? The epistles. Very good. So we're not going to name these just yet, but it's Romans to Jude. These are the letters or epistles, but it's the 21 books, if you will, but that follow the book of Acts, not including Revelation. That's separate. But it's Romans to Jude. Now, we'll get into more of this next week, but these epistles can be broken down into 2 more divisions. You have what's called the Pauline epistles. Those are the ones that Paul wrote. And then you have what's called the general epistles. And those are all the other ones. Okay, so you have Paul's, and then you have everybody else's. Now, there are more of Paul's than everybody else's. this is always kind of interesting to me. Okay, why are the books, the epistles, these 21 epistles, why are they ordered the way they are? You know, why are they why does Romans come first? Why is 1st and 2nd Corinthians next? Why is Jude last? Right? Who put? Because it's not chronological. I mean, we're not necessarily getting the first New Testament letter first, right? It's not necessarily in that, because I think 1st John might be the. Don't hold me on that. I'll back up. But it's not necessarily in chronological order as far as when those epistles were written. So why are they in the order they were in? Well, here it is. This is groundbreaking. They're in the order of largest letter to smallest letter. Romans is largest. Jude, or take the epistles of Paul first. Romans is the largest. What's the last epistle of Paul? Philemon. Tiny little book. So it's from the largest book. And of course they combine 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, right? But that's basically the order. You have the larger books working down to the shorter books or shorter letters. And then when you get to the general epistles, beginning with Hebrews, well, guess what? Hebrews is a large book. And then what's the last general epistle? Jude, little tiny book. So it's basically going from the larger epistle, general epistle, to the small. There's the genius behind it. Not a lot, but that's it. Once that made sense to me, I'm like, okay, makes sense. We can move on. What's the 4th division of the New Testament? Revelation. And what book could this be? Revelation. And by the way, I accidentally said it just a while ago. It's Revelation, not Revelations. Right? It's actually a pet peeve of mine. It's Revelation, no S on the end. So what is this book? Prophecy. Prophecy. Okay, so let's back up. Let's review. So let's just say these together. Ready? 120 go to the upper room. I only heard me. Ready? The 120 go to the upper room. Philip's trip to Samaria. Saul's trip to Damascus. Peter's trip to the house of Cornelius. The gathering at Antioch. All right, 5 trips in the second half of the book of Acts. Paul's first missionary trip. The council at Jerusalem. Paul's second missionary trip. Paul's third missionary trip. Paul's arrest and trip to Rome. 4 segments of the New Testament. Somebody tell me what the first segment is. The Gospels. Very good. What's the next one? Acts. What's the next one? The epistles. What's next? Revelation. Perfect. The Gospels. Somebody tell me the 4 books. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what are these 4 books about? Sum them up for me. Life and ministry of Jesus. Okay, what's segment number 2? Acts, and what book? Acts, and what is it about? It's history, and it's the birth and first 30 years of the church. What's the third segment? The epistles, and this is from Romans to Jude, or the 21 letters after the book of Acts, that follow the book of Acts. I don't expect you to remember this necessarily, but if we divided these up into 2 more categories, we could divide them up between whose letters? Paul's letters, and then we call the others the general epistles, general letters. And the reason why they're called that is, well, we're not sure who wrote Hebrews, right? And then we have James. He wrote James. And then we have 1st and 2nd Peter. So Peter wrote that. We have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. John wrote that. And then we have Jude. Jude wrote that. So they're classified as the general epistles. What's the 4th segment? Revelation, and it is the book of Revelation. And what is Revelation about? Prophecy. Very good. 4 segments of the New Testament. I think you've got those down. The first 4 books of the New Testament are the 4 Gospels. Wow, that didn't line up. The 5th book is the book of Acts. The next 21 books are known as the epistles. The final book of the New Testament is known as the book of Revelation. Very good. Now, sorry that's not lined up. It just didn't convert right when I changed programs. You see, this makes it easier to memorize the books of the New Testament. Okay, divide them up in your 4 segments. We have the Gospels, already know them. We have the book, the Acts, that's the book of Acts. Revelation, okay, now we just have these 21 books in between. But let's divide them up. We have Paul's and we have general. So we just work on Paul's. That's probably the hardest one, working on Paul's. But there's all kinds of ways to work on Paul's letters, and we'll work on that next week. And I'm sure somebody knows a rap song or something they can share with us to memorize these books, and so y'all can share that with us. Okay. The Gospels give us the story and the life ministry of Jesus. Man, that one got way off. The book of blank gives us the story of the birth and first 30 years of the church. Acts. Wow. Okay, we're done. Questions? Comments? Do what? Miletus? Okay. Okay. All right. I could not remember. My mind went blank. Well, thank y'all for being here tonight. Next week we'll look at these next couple of chapters. I was planning. I think we're going to the last week of this month, but we may end up finishing next week. We'll just see how that goes. We may end up finishing next week. Let's pray, and we'll be dismissed. Skip, do you mind dismissing us in prayer?